You know this story. Girl, evil stepmother, glass slipper. Prince saves her, they live happily ever after, credits roll, forget it. Forget every version you've ever heard, the Disney one, the Grimm one, the one your mom read you at bedtime. Because tonight the slipper still fits. The prince still shows up. He still kneels down and offers her everything. And she still says no. Stay till the end, because the reason why she says no isn't a twist. It's the whole point of the story you were never told. This is Cinderella, if she'd finally had enough. This is the glass debt. Ella had counted the stairs in her stepmother's house 4,211 times. She counted them again now, on her knees, scrubbing the 11th step, because 11 was where the wood had rotted soft and the polish never quite hid the stain. Nobody remembered how the stain got there. Ella had a theory. She kept it to herself, the way she kept most things, folded small, tucked under the floorboard of her own room, next to her mother's wedding ring and a letter she had never been brave enough to finish reading. Her stepmother, Ruth, was not cruel in the way stories tell it. She never raised a hand. She didn't need to. Cruelty, Ella had learned, could also sound like a sigh. Like, "You look tired, dear, but then you always do." Like assigning Ella the last chair at dinner, the one angled just slightly away from the candlelight, so that in every family portrait for 6 years, Ella's face sat in shadow. Her stepsisters, Beatrice and me, weren't monsters either. That was the part the old stories always got wrong, Ella thought. Monsters were easy to hate. Beatrice braided Ella's hair sometimes when Ruth wasn't watching and whispered apologies for things she never had the courage to stop. Me left an extra biscuit on Ella's plate at breakfast and never once mentioned it. Kindness in small, cowardly doses, enough to keep Ella from hatting them completely, never enough to change anything. That was the cage. Not iron bars, just enough gentleness to make the cruelty bearable and therefore permanent. There was a fourth person in that house, too, one the old stories never mention at all. His name was Thomas, the groundskeeper, 60 years old, who had worked the estate since before Ella's father married Ruth. Thomas never spoke much. But every winter, without fail, a second coat appeared folded on Ella's bed, too big. Always a man's coat cut down with clumsy, careful stitches. And every winter, Ella pretended not to know where it came from, because some kindnesses only survive if nobody names them out loud. She thought sometimes that Thomas was the only person in that house who saw her plainly, not as a burden, not as competition for her stepsisters, just as a girl cold doing her best. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a palace courier in a blue coat too clean for the mud season. The kingdom's Prince Edmund, 23, recently returned from 3 years abroad building trade routes. Nobody in the village fully understood was hosting a ball, officially to celebrate his return. Unofficially, and everyone knew it, to find a wife before his father's failing health forced the succession question into daylight. Ruth read the invitation twice, smoothed it against the table, and looked at her daughters with the specific hunger of a woman who had spent a decade waiting for a door to open. "You won't be going," she told Ella not unkindly, just as fact the way one might say it will rain tomorrow. "There isn't a dress, there isn't time, and frankly, dear, a prince wants a bride who's rested, you understand." Ella understood. She always understood. Understanding was the only power anyone had ever let her keep. She said nothing. She went back to the 11th stair. But that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry, not loudly, not where anyone could hear, just a slow, silent leak of 6 years finally finding a crack. And when she was done, she did something she had never done before. She wrote a letter, not the one under the floorboard, a new one, to no one, just words finally let out of the cage in her chest. "I am so tired of being tolerated. I want just once to be chosen." She didn't know, folding that letter into her pocket, that it would matter later, that someone would find it, that its very existence would become a piece of evidence in a story far bigger than a ball. Here is where the story, if you've heard it before, tells you a fairy godmother arrived. A pumpkin, glass slippers spun from moonlight and magic that only lasted until midnight. There was no fairy godmother. There was a woman named Old Marin, who lived at the edge of the village and who Ella had, for 2 years, quietly and without telling anyone, been bringing bread to on Sunday mornings, sneaking it out under her shawl, walking 40 minutes each way before her chores began, because Marin had no family and the village had decided long ago that a woman who lived alone and talked to crows was better left alone entirely. Marin was not magic. Marin was simply someone who remembered things. She had been the seamstress to Ella's real mother, years before Ella's father remarried and then died and left Ella to Ruth's particular arithmetic of care. In the back of Marin's cottage, under a sheet gray with dust, hung a dress that had belonged to Ella's mother, sapphire blue, hand-sewn with 300 hours of stitching, never worn because Ella's mother had died the week before she meant to wear it to a ball very much like this one. "She'd want you to have this," Marin said, and her hands, spotted with age, shook only slightly as she pinned the last seam to fit Ella's smaller frame. "She'd want you to go." There was no glass slipper spun from magic. There was a pair of Ella's mother's old dancing shoes, kept in a cedar box, slightly too large, which Marin stuffed with wool at the heel so they wouldn't slip. "Be back by midnight," Marin said, and here finally was something that sounded like the old story. "Ruth checks the house at midnight. If she finds your bed empty, I don't know what she'll do. So be careful, be smart. This isn't magic, child. Nothing saves you at midnight but your own 2 feet." Ella nodded. She did not know yet how much that warning would matter, or that Marin, watching her walk off toward the palace lights, would stand in her doorway a long time afterward, wearing an expression far heavier than a well-wisher's should have been. Because Marin knew something Ella didn't. Something about that stain on the 11th stair. Something she had decided for 2 years of Sunday bread not yet to say. The ball was everything the village had whispered it would be, and Ella, for one single night, let herself want something without immediately calculating its cost. Prince Edmund found her by the east window, half hidden behind a pillar because some old habit made her flinch from open rooms. He didn't ask her name first. He asked what she was hiding from. "Attention," she said, before she could stop herself. He laughed, not the polite court laugh she'd watched him give a dozen other girls that night, but something surprised and real. "That's the first honest thing anyone said to me in 3 years." They talked. Not about the kingdom, not about his travels, not about anything a suitor was supposed to discuss with a prince. He asked what she read. She asked if he was tired of people wanting things from him. He said yes, immediately, like the question had been sitting behind his teeth for years waiting for someone to ask it. He told her something he said he'd never told anyone outside his own family, that he hadn't wanted to come back from his travels at all, that the crown felt, most days, like a coat 2 sizes too small, cut for a man he wasn't sure he was becoming. Ella listened and did not flinch, and did not try to fix it for him. She just let it be true in the room between them, which, it turned out, was the only thing he'd actually wanted from anyone in 3 years. For 3 hours Ella forgot to count anything. Not stairs, not slights, not the days since anyone had asked her a real question and waited, actually waited for a real answer. At 2 minutes to midnight, she remembered Marin's warning and ran. She lost a shoe on the palace steps, not by magic, not by any spell breaking, but because she was running too fast down stone stairs in shoes a half size too big, stuffed with wool that had finally worked loose. She didn't go back for it. Going back for it would have cost her the 11 minutes she needed to beat Ruth home. She made it. Barely. Ruth checked the house at midnight exactly, as promised, and found Ella's bed occupied, Ella's breathing even, Ella's dress hidden beneath the floorboard with her mother's ring and the unfinished letter, the old one, and the new one, both now tucked together like 2 versions of the same wound. What Ruth did not know, what nobody knew yet, was that Ruth had also attended the ball. In a different dress, at the edge of a different room, watching her daughters fail to catch the prince's eye while a girl she didn't recognize captured 3 uninterrupted hours of his attention by the east window. Ruth had spent that entire ball trying to place the stranger's face. She placed it around 1 a.m., lying awake, running the shape of the girl's jaw and the particular way she held her shoulders, braced, always braced, like she was waiting to be struck, against a face she'd looked at across a dinner table, half-shadowed for 6 years. By morning, Ruth knew exactly whose foot that shoe belonged to. Not glass, Ruth had seen it clearly at the ball before it was lost. A leather dancing shoe, worn soft at the heel, the sole stamped with a maker's mark from a shop that had closed 15 years ago. The same shop, Ruth remembered now, that had made her late husband's first wife's wedding trousseau. Ruth sat with that knowledge a long time before dawn. And here is the part the old story never tells you. Ruth's face in that dark hour did not look like triumph. It looked like fear. Because if Ella had been at that ball, wearing that dress, then Ruth's carefully built version of the last 6 years, the version where she was simply weary, simply overwhelmed, simply doing her imperfect best with a child that wasn't hers, was about to come apart in front of a prince with the power to ask questions nobody in that village had ever dared ask. Here is where the old story says the prince searched the kingdom, slipper in hand, trying it on every foot until he found the one it fit. That did happen, almost. Edmund did search. He was, underneath the crown and the expectations, a genuinely decent man who had spent one evening with a girl who spoke to him like a person instead of a position, and he intended to find her again. He carried that single shoe from house to house for 2 days, and something in him, something he couldn't name, insisted this search mattered more than any of the political matches his advisors kept steering him toward. But Ruth found him first. She arrived at the palace 2 days later, alone, without her daughters, carrying the shoe's twin, the second shoe from the pair, which she had located in the cedar box under Ella's bed while Ella was out drawing water, and which she now presented to the prince with an expression of careful, rehearsed grief. "I know the girl you're looking for," Ruth said. "She is my late husband's daughter, and I regret to tell you, your highness, that she died 3 winters ago, fever. I kept her shoes because I could not bear to give them away. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. I know it isn't the ending you hoped for." She had thought about this lie for 2 days. She had built it carefully, the way she built everything, plausible, sad enough to discourage questions, small enough not to unravel. What Ruth had not accounted for was grief being a door, not a wall. Edmund did not simply accept it and move on. He asked to see where the girl was buried. He asked her name so he could pay respects. He asked, gently, if he might speak to her sisters, who surely remembered her. Ruth had not thought that far ahead. Nobody's careful lies ever survive someone else's careful kindness. She stalled. She said the grave was in the family plot, 2 days' ride north, too far for a proper visit so soon. She said the girl's name had been hard for the family to speak since the fever took her. Every answer bought her a little time and cost her a little more credibility, though she couldn't yet see the second part. Edmund rode north anyway, alone, without telling Ruth. It took him a day to discover there was no family plot 2 days north, and another to realize the shop that made the shoes leather was, in fact, still open, just relocated, and its owner remembered clearly and fondly the last dress and shoes he'd made. A commission 15 years ago, for a woman named Elise, Ella's mother, whom the shopkeeper had heard, through the ordinary gossip of small towns, was survived by a daughter still very much alive. Beatrice broke first, not out of malice, out of the accumulated weight of 6 years watching her mother do small cruelties and calling them love. When the prince returned and visited the house under the guise of paying respects, Beatrice found herself alone with him in the garden for 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, something in her simply gave out. "She's not dead," Beatrice said. "She's in the kitchen right now. She's always in the kitchen." She said it and immediately felt the specific horror of a person who has just detonated the only life they've ever known. Me, watching from the doorway, said nothing. But her silence, this time, cracked visibly across her face. And years later, she would say that watching Beatrice's confession was the moment she understood how much of her own comfort had been quietly built on someone else's erasure. What happened next is the part of the story most people, telling it afterward, choose to soften. The truth is this: Ruth, confronted, did not confess and beg forgiveness. Ruth, cornered, escalated. In the 11 minutes between Beatrice's confession and Edmund walking into that kitchen, Ruth told Ella, quietly, viciously, for the first time in 6 years, dropping every pretense of gentle cruelty, exactly what she thought of her: that she was a burden inherited from a marriage Ruth had never wanted. That her mother's death had been, in Ruth's private opinion, the one convenient thing the woman ever did. That Ella's presence in this house for 6 years had been tolerated, not loved, and Ruth resented every meal, every stitch of clothing, every ounce of shelter she'd ever grudgingly provided. And then, at the very end, almost as an afterthought, almost as if the truth had simply run out of room to hide: "Your father knew what I thought of you before he died. He knew, and he still left you here. Ask yourself what that tells you." That sentence would sit in Ella for years, long after everything else had healed. Not the insults, that one specific surgical cruelty, because it wasn't designed to wound in the moment. It was designed to wound later, alone, at 2 a.m., for the rest of her life. Ella had spent 6 years absorbing small cruelties, without ever once seeing the size of the thing underneath them. Now she saw it whole. And when Edmund walked into that kitchen 30 seconds later, expecting, hopping, to find the girl from the east window, he found Ella on her knees on the 11th stair, not scrubbing it this time, just sitting there, hollowed out, staring at a stain nobody had ever explained to her. He knelt down in front of her. He held out the shoe. "I've been looking for you," he said, gently, the way he had at the ball. "You don't have to stay here another day. Come with me. It's over. You're safe now. This is where the story you know ends. The shoe fits. The girl is saved. The wedding bells ring and cruelty is punished, and everyone who has ever felt small and unseen gets to believe, for one warm hour, that rescue arrives on time." Ella looked at the shoe. She looked at Edmund's face, earnest, kind, genuinely wanting to save her. She looked at Ruth, frozen in the doorway, and Beatrice crying silently by the window, and me, who had said nothing this whole time and would carry that silence for years. And Ella said no. Not out of anger, not as a twist for cruelty's sake. She said it the way you'd finally set down something you'd carried so long your arms had forgotten how to hang empty. "You want to save me," she told him, and her voice didn't shake. "That's not the same as knowing me. You spent 3 hours with a girl at a ball who forgot, for one night, everything that was wrong in her life. You fell in love with someone who wasn't tired. I am always tired, Edmund. If you take me from this house tonight, you're not rescuing me. You're just becoming the next person I have to be brave enough to disappoint. And I don't have the strength left to build myself around someone else's version of my rescue. Not even a kind one. Not even yours." She stood. She left the shoe on the 11th stair, where the stain was, she'd learned, weeks later, from Marin, exactly whose blood that stain belonged to. It had been her mother's. From the night Elise fell on those very stairs, sick and unattended, the week before the ball she never got to wear the sapphire dress to, a fall Ruth had witnessed, and out of some cold, self-preserving instinct, never once mentioned or explained in 6 long years. Ella would carry that truth the way she carried everything, quietly and alone, and finally on her own terms. She walked past Edmund, past Ruth, past the house that had spent 6 years teaching her that love was something you earned through smallness. She did not go to the palace. She went to Marin's cottage, where there was a spare room and a woman who had never once, in 2 years of Sunday bread, asked Ella to be anything other than exactly as tired as she actually was. And on the doorstep, waiting, was Thomas, the groundskeeper who had left her coats every winter and asked for nothing. holding the last of her belongings he'd quietly gathered from the house before she'd even decided where she'd go. Because some people simply know before you do that you're about to need somewhere safe to land. Prince Edmund never married. Not out of heartbreak exactly, out of something closer to a permanent, quiet reordering of what he thought love was supposed to look like. He kept the shoe. Some nights he took it out and simply looked at it, not with longing, but with something more like respect. Years later, when he finally did choose someone, it was a woman who challenged him the way Ella had, that one night by the east window, and when people asked him what changed his mind about love, he told them simply that a girl in a kitchen once taught him the difference between being wanted and being seen. Ruth spent the rest of her life in a house with two daughters who no longer fully trusted her, in rooms with a stain on the 11th stair that she refinished 4 times, and that somehow, every time, bled back through the polish within the month. A stain that was never, in the end, about blood at all, but about a truth that refused to stay buried under 6 years of careful cruelty. And Ella grew old in Marin's cottage. Then Marin's cottage was hers alone, and she took in exactly one stray, tired girl a year, no more, taught her to read, fed her, and asked her always on the very first night, "What are you hiding from?" She never went to another ball. She never needed rescuing again, because she had finally understood the thing the old story got backwards. The glass slipper was never the proof that she belonged to someone. It was the proof that she had, for one night, run fast enough to belong only to herself. So, happy ending or not. Because here's the thing. Ella didn't get the prince, but she got something the story never gave her a version of before, a choice. And maybe that's the actual twist, not that this story is dark, but that it's honest about what rescue really costs. If this hit you differently than you expected, if somewhere in there you found yourself rooting for her to say no, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want the next story before it drops, because trust me, the next one flips a happier tale the other direction, hit subscribe, and turn the notification bell on, because these twists only work if you don't see them coming. I'm Noah, and this has been a different story to tell. See you in the next one.